The 15th BRICS summit recently concluded in Johannesburg in South Africa. Now, this edition of the summit is being looked upon as giving a new direction, impetus to the grouping that actually held its founding summit in 2009 in Yekaterinburg in Russia. Eventually, South Africa attended the third summit of the expanded grouping, which was now called as BRICS, in Sanya in China on 14th of April 2011. So since 2011, for the first time, BRICS has paved the way for new members to join in. The most significant outcome of the 15th summit is the decision to expand this membership. 6 countries, including Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, they have been invited as full members with effect from 1st of January 2024. And once they join, the forum would have 6 of the top 10 oil-producing countries of the world. Some other countries are being considered as dialogue partners, as Prime Minister Modi informed. Now, in this expansion, which was led by China, it was backed by Russia and South Africa initially. How is this being seen for India? What kind of a power shift does BRICS 2.0 signify? What is the geopolitical impact of groupings like SCO BRICS today? These are some of the questions that we will seek to discuss in this episode. Hi, everyone. You've tuned in to episode 13 of the Foreign Policy Podcast Beyond Nation and State on Suno India. I'm your host and independent journalist, Smita Sharma. You can listen in to all the episodes of the podcast on Suno India app, on Apple as well as Spotify podcasts. And you can watch the video segment that drops in later on the YouTube station, Smita Sharma Journalist. On this episode of Beyond Nation and State, I have with me the 1982 Indian Foreign Services batch retired career diplomat Pankaj Saran. He has served as India's ambassador to Russia, as a former High Commissioner to Bangladesh, also as India's National Deputy Security Advisor, among the many prominent roles that he has played. Currently, he's the convener of NatStrat, which is a Delhi-based independent center for research on strategic and security issues. And you can engage with him on Twitter at @Pankaj Saran 11. Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran, for joining me here on this podcast.
Thank you, Smita, for inviting me. It's a delight. Thank you.
If I could start with post the BRICS session that concluded in Johannesburg, there was a very interesting chat going on in the Foreign Policy Reporters official group as to how it should be named. Somebody suggested maybe it should be called as BRICS 6 in Romans, to which somebody said it could be read as BRICS She. Jokes aside, at the moment, of course, it stays as BRICS, but with the expansion, do you think that there will be a new acronym that should come into place?
Well, I think given the number of candidates who want to get into BRICS, it's going to be difficult to find a name, an alphabet soup. So I suspect we might continue with BRICS for some time, although a hint was given by the Prime Minister in his speech when, if you recall, in his last sentence, he actually kind of elaborated on the words BRICS. So he moved away from the names of the countries to talk about concepts, linking each concept with a particular letter of the alphabet. So it's possible that, you could have some innovative, imaginative solution, but frankly, it's going to be a difficult call to find a new alphabet soup.
Of course, we'll come to that expansion, which was the significant outcome in a little bit. But I just want to rewind first, because for those who are either unversed or the younger audiences, because you were in the Prime Minister's office as a joint secretary between 2007 and 12. So you basically saw India's interest, India's initiative in joining BRICS when it was BRIC, rather, the founding summit in Yekaterinburg. Give us a sense of what was India's incentive and argument then, the government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh, to be a part of that grouping.
Yeah, I was there. I was there in 2009 in the Yekaterinburg first summit. And we went through exactly more or less the same kind of internal introspection as we are going through today with regard to any new grouping, whether it is Quad or this or that. Before 2009, the BRIC grouping used to meet on the sidelines in New York. It used to meet at lower levels. Then it graduated to the foreign minister level. And then finally, it was actually President Putin who said, we must have a standalone summit meeting. Now, 2009 was significant for 2 reasons. Firstly, we were just coming out of the global financial crisis. It was actually a terrible moment for the global economy, and which was basically in shambles. And the second was we just concluded the Indo-US Nuclear Deal in 2008. That was literally the high point of our relationship with the United States. So there was a lot of trepidation within the government on whether India should, even before the ink has dried on the Indo-US nuclear deal, go and sit with Russia and China and Brazil and join a grouping which the West had convinced itself was a challenge to the Western order. So there was this, there were mixed views, mixed recommendations. But then finally, to give due credit to the Indian strategic mind, I mean, we actually went in and we sat in that meeting. And the actors at that stage were, ironically, President Lula, who's back, President Medvedev, President Hu Jintao, and of course, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. So it was a very, very interesting beginning. No one imagined that it would go so far. And I think we went with open eyes. We had no real illusions about what BRIC could deliver. The only thing, of course, was at that time the only shining spot on the global economy was China. And this was admitted by the G7 and everyone else because their economies had collapsed. And it was only China which was holding global economic growth a little bit on the green side, but otherwise everyone was red. And
Because this was also being looked upon then as a grouping of four emerging economies which would have a substantive market by 2050. One of the reasons also, the acronym which came into existence by one of the Goldman Sachs economists. So would you say that at the initial point it was really driven by simply pure financial reasons? It wasn't really a political reason on New Delhi's part to be a part of this grouping?
I think it was a bit of both. I think we never had any illusions about the economic strengths of either Brazil, with all due respect, or Russia. I think the point was that India felt that it would be useful in the medium to long term to have a strategic option, and so there was a mixed impulse going into it. But I would say more it was rather political and strategic, not so much economic. Although, as I said, the China factor was there, and those were the days when our relations with China were definitely better than what they are today. So it was, I would say, a mix of both. But we went with open eyes. I mean, it was not as if BRIC is going to give us the solutions at that stage for either our own economic growth or the global financial health. Um, but it was, even at that time, the view was, don't box yourself into one set of alliances or coalitions. You actually have to play all sides without sacrificing your relationship, as I mentioned to you, with the United States, which was, in fact, at its peak at that time. 2008 was really the purple patch of the relationship.
Yeah, and still remember those days. The common refrain whenever somebody would talk about India and China would be being the hardware and the software of the emerging world of Asia. But then 2010, the acceptance was given to bring in South Africa into the folding. And 2000, they finally, of course, attended the third BRICS summit in Sanya in China. So where did this decision stem from to get in South Africa into the fold as well?
So, again, I think this was to get regional balance into the group. And the presence of an African country was considered to be desirable to make the organization more palatable, because South Africa was also seen to be more of a kind of a liberal democratic polity, which would somehow improve the image of BRIC, which at that time was raising a lot of suspicions in the West. So it was, I think, just basically to widen the regional representation. And I was there in Sanya. We had President Dilma Rousseff. Again, imagine she's today the president of the New Development Bank. So the actors are actually coming back after so many years. And of course, from there, the grouping, took major strides, leaps of faith. I think one of them, which no one expected, was the establishment of the new development bank.
So, Ambassador Saran, now coming back to the Johannesburg summit, and we've seen the significant outcome decision, a consensus to get in 6 countries: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Would you like to go maybe one by one as to what really is the value add of bringing in these 6 countries?
I don't know whether that's going to be very useful. I think it's a mix of geography and many other political factors that have gone into this consensus. I think the main issue was you wanted to have geographical representation and you also wanted consensus. And I think here the Indian diplomatic role is being understated. Because if you look at all 6, the fact of the matter is that we have actually excellent relations with all of them. And I don't think this is a coincidence. So I think the level of comfort that we had with this set of expansion, this 6, is actually quite high. So you cannot say that any one of them has come in despite India's objections, or that in any of them are going to be difficult for us to manage. I mean,
Because there's a lot of
yeah.
commentary and there are a lot of media reports to say that, of course, India is on board with the expansion, but initially the idea was pushed by the Chinese. It was backed by Russia and South Africa, and then the others also came on board. So you don't think that this expansion will lead to a situation where it will be more favorably tilted towards China?
Well, that's one way of looking at it, but I would like to look at it from another point of view, which is you cannot force people to join a grouping. What I want to see is the other side of the picture. And the other side of the picture is that there are at least 40 countries, according to media reports, which are keen to join this group. Now, it is not as if China is forcing them to join. The fact is, they feel that there is a need or there is a desire among them to join this grouping. This says a lot about the current global situation and less about China. And I think we should not get too fixated about China because, frankly, even if China wanted, you cannot rustle up 40 countries and force them to join. I mean, there is a there is a pull effect. I mean, there is a voice of the global South which is actually saying that I want to be part of this grouping. No one is coercing them or forcing them. And to me, that is the big story. That there is and why are they saying this? Why are they feeling this? Are they dissatisfied with the current global international system or the global order? Or are they beholden to China? Or they see some big merit out of this? I think the answer is the first, that there is some degree of dissatisfaction with the way the current international system is playing out. And, so you have even staunch US allies like the Saudis and the UAE and Egypt and all these countries, Argentina. I mean, they're all joining in. So it's not a China club. I mean, and we should not look at it that way because that is too simplistic and I think misjudged. I mean, there are a lot of the Western commentators are trying to put this spin on this current expansion. And secondly, the same Western commentators have been mocking BRICS since the day it was born, saying it's a useless organization. It is full of contradictions, pointing to all the faults and the defects in the grouping. But if that is the case, then what's the problem? Because if we have another 10, 12, 20 countries, in any case, it's going to implode. You cannot have such a diverse organization. So even when you had 4, you were under criticism. Now you're going to have 20 or 30, you're again under criticism. So the criticism actually lacks credibility. I think, look, we are big enough and confident enough to play the game, which everyone is doing, whether it is Russia or China or the United States. And The next phase, we'll see who comes. And I frankly, and I'm sure at some stage, Pakistan is going to be knocking on the doors. It's a matter of time. The only question is, what will they bring to the table apart from their strategic presence? Because, you know, so uh, so I think the expansion should be not overinterpreted.
But
Uh,
I would still want to ask you a little bit more because we also have a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which though is a sort of a bridge between Central Asia, Eurasia, South Asia, different members maybe, but one of the common things that seems to be in these groupings is that you're increasingly looking at forums which are not led by the US led West, and which may have a lot of middle countries which don't want to be part of any particular camps during conflicts. So, would you say then that these forums, whether it's regional, whether it's this kind of a grouping like BRICS, that they're increasingly working on these principles because the multi alignment or multilateralism of the global institutions like United Nations seems to be compromised?
Yeah, I think so. I think people are increasingly beginning to realize that perhaps the United Nations is looking more and more of a derelict and incompetent organization, which is useful for now a lesser and lesser number of purposes. So let us look at, say, for example, multi-alignment, right? You mentioned BRICS, you mentioned SCO, but let's take just the BRICS expansion. And the same breath, you also have the I2U2. You have Israel and Saudi and India and the United States. You have Saudi also in BRICS. So I think we are entering this period or this era of the global system where you will not be able to identify uh, black and white. You will find contradictions and you will find countries pursuing their interests as they see appropriate. Now, the classical era of alliances that we were grown up with during the Cold War, the Western Alliance, the Soviet Alliance, I'm not sure whether that is going to continue in such a way forever. I just want to, in this context, also mention another organization, which again, there was a lot of churning in India on whether we should join, and we were put on the horns of a dilemma, which was the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Again, Chinese led. Now, this is not even 10 years old. BRICS is also not even, the New Development Bank is also not even 10 years old. These are young organizations. So, what happened in the case of the AIIB was the question arose whether India should become a founding member. And again, there was this whole thing about China led, etc. Finally, after a lot of internal discussion, it was decided we will become a founding member. But you know what? Soon thereafter, we found European countries also becoming founding members, led by the United Kingdom, a staunch US ally, Germany, Italy, France. I mean, I read all this before coming out of this show. So, they all became members of the AIIB. Now, what does it tell you about how countries behave? And let me also just add to this that US led, Western led, etc. But we have to put it in some kind of a proportion. The AIIB and the New Development Bank, let's put these two together. Together, they have lent to India a total of about $10 billion since their creation. And many projects, including this Meerut RRTS and Chennai Metro, etc., are being funded. Clearly, a lot of this money is Chinese. But the total exposure to India by both these banks is 10 billion. The exposure of the World Bank to India is 130 billion, right? We are the largest recipients of ODA from the World Bank, which, let us say loosely, is a US led Bretton Woods institution. Similarly, the Asian Development Bank, they have lent us close to, I think, 50 or $55 billion. So the scale of these organizations or groupings in proportion to the current Bretton Woods institutions or the Western led world order has to be seen in a perspective, and they are still very nascent, very young. I don't think, frankly, we should be running away from these organizations because of the C word. We we are India. I mean, we play this, we can. And after all, the global south is not anyone's preserve. And so we will see increasingly over the next coming period a bit of a competition, I would say, between India and China for the global south.
But having said that, for instance, in BRICS, we are still not talking about a common currency for BRICS. What is being spoken about is using national currencies for intra trading. Now, you have two members here, Russia and then, of course, Iran coming in, who are under Western sanctions, who cannot go in for SWIFT transactions. What do you see as the economic impact of BRICS, really on on countries that are undergoing sanctions? Will it help strengthen them against that? The benefits for India, will it also pave the way for de-dollarization?
Look, I don't see any common currency coming out of BRICS for the next many, many, many years. This de-dollarization talk is not based on fact. If you look at the global financial transactions and trade transactions, the non-dollar trade and transactions are statistically insignificant. The only people who are trying to do a little bit of this is the yuan, and that's it. I mean, not even the ruble. So yes, in the IMF, what has happened is that because of the quota reform, there is a more weightage now given to the yuan. But we are far, far away from de-dollarization. I think what may happen probably is more trade in local currency between, say, India and Russia, or perhaps even India and China when if things improve, or India and Iran, which has already happened, we know, in the past. So trade in local currencies is possible. A common currency doesn't seem to be on the horizon. And in terms of economic benefit, I think it still has to be with this expanded BRICS. We have to see which way this turns, because many of them are energy producing. How
Hmm.
that impacts their cooperation within this expanded BRICS is something which I'm not sure people have thought through. I think immediate the priority was to just expand, develop that consensus. I think most of the energies of the BRICS was exhausted in finding a consensus on who to take in the first phase. Now the real work will begin. Now, what do you
Hmm.
do with them? And
Right.
and I think we have to basically keep our feet in all waters. I mean, that I think is an absolutely essential fact of life. And the beauty is that I think the West, the collective West, so to say, acknowledges and understands this. Maybe not the strategic experts who sometimes are more fiery,
But I
but
was
I
going to
think
ask you this because, initially also you mentioned that when BRIC came into existence, that entire US led West suspicion of the organization as it being an anti West formulation in some sort of a way, doesn't that stand to increase when you have more and more, in fact, critiques coming in, or groups that that they don't see eye to eye coming in? And does this increase India's balancing act when it comes to being a part of Quad and the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum on one hand, also being a part of SCO and BRICS on the other?
no, there is a risk that some hotheads and some radical countries might try to hijack the agenda. But this is already happening. I mean, in BRICS, there are positions which Russia and China take. In the SCO, there are positions which they both take, which sometimes can be terribly anti-Western or anti-American. India doesn't subscribe to those views, and we maintain our position. So it is not as if we are swayed by their posturing. The interesting thing is that whether we can then maintain this modicum of balance in the BRICS working and in the agenda. But again, I would say there is something happening on the street of the global south to explain why there is a rush for joining BRICS. I can't attribute it only to the brilliance of Chinese diplomacy. There has to be something going on. And it may be all for the better if we have to reduce global tensions between these major powers who, frankly, have, I think, completely failed in managing their tensions. and putting all of us hostage. So I think our association with BRICS or SCO or its expansion will not, in my opinion, impact on our relationship with the West and with the United States, because I think there is a fair degree of understanding in India that these are vital partnerships and they have to be preserved. So this is where we are. I mean, the AIIB, I think, offers a good example. I mean, you have Western allies, members of the AIIB,
Right.
and at that time when the UK joined, there was a huge kind of dust up between the United Kingdom and the US, and the US was very unhappy. But so these things, these contradictions, I think are going to increasingly become part of the landscape.
But also, just a last couple of questions. When you look at the outcome document, I think one significant miss, which is also pointed out by a couple of other media reports, is Afghanistan, which was actually mentioned in 2022 declaration. This was, of course, the first in-person summit meeting that was happening since 2019. How do you look at that? Forums like SCO, BRICS, wouldn't India want these to push more and be able to do more? Would they have more equity and stakes in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a surprising omission. I mean, I really don't know why Afghanistan was not mentioned. I really can't understand because, at one level, uh, all of us have fairly similar positions on, the issue of recognizing Taliban, the question of, extremism, terrorism. So I really can't understand why it wasn't there. I mean, it's usually there always in the SCO communiques. So, but even on terrorism, for example, if you look at the paragraph, it's a simple reproduction of previous formulations. On the question of expansion and reform of the Security Council, again, there's nothing much in it. And here both Russia and China have been blocking. They just pay lip service, and I mean, there's this kind of a generic statement.
They talk
So
about legitimate aspirations this time for the other
yeah,
three members of BRICS.
yeah, and they actually preface it with Africa, Latin
Yeah.
America, and then they say including India, Brazil, and South Africa. So it's weak. But frankly, I think we as a country have gone beyond worrying about these formulations, because frankly, I think we are rightly, I think, convinced that time is on our side. It's a matter of time before, and if all the action is going to be out of the United Nations, then I think the decision that we are, or the approach that we are witnessing with the current government in India, is that we will be there everywhere. We will not leave space for anyone to set the agenda. You will find India everywhere. And I think that's one way of looking at doing it. The other is saying, oh no, you are bad guys, I'm not going to touch you. So it's a judgment call, it's a political approach. And since this is the government in office, we have to kind of accept the logic and the judgment they are exercising, which has merit, that you do not want to give a strategic pass, so to say, to anyone. And
You rather be in the room, instead of being outside it and not being a part of the deliberations. Ambassador Saran, just the last two questions. One of the significant, in fact, meeting that took place during the sidelines of the BRICS summit was that meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. Of course, it took place on 23rd August. Foreign Secretary Quatra actually revealed the meeting only a day after, and it was characterized differently by the Chinese, and then sources followed within New Delhi, similar to what had happened with the Bali G20 meeting, because initially we said that they did not meet, then the Chinese put out a release and India changed its stance. So, why this sort of, Indian diplomatic reticence in defining the character of these meetings right up, instead of trying to play chase up to, and providing reactions to how the Chinese define these meetings? And B, do you think this could actually pave the way for a meaningful peace on the line of actual control?
Yeah, I think, and to your first question, I think the reason is clear that, we are the aggrieved party in 2020. Now, it is for the Chinese to actually take that extra step and move that extra mile to address India's concerns. I mean, the precipitation of the situation in 2020 had nothing to do with us, but everything to do with the Chinese. Now, if you want to repair the relationship, the onus is completely on China. I am not obliged to somehow, kind of, because I was not responsible for the deterioration. So I think that is one reason why the Indian approach has become cautious. Once bitten, twice shy. On the second part about whether the impact on the relationship, I think this is work in progress. Clearly, the NSAs have met a couple of months ago. There have been other exchanges. So let us see what happens in Delhi during the G20 and whether these meetings and conversations are paving the way for a formal bilateral meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi in Delhi.
Does it look like a Doklam sort of a deja vu when the crisis finally resolved after the two leaders met?
It could be, but it's not easy. It's not easy because everything that we are hearing says that there is very little give from the Chinese on the two core areas of direct concern, military concern to us. And the second thing is that the status quo in terms of mobilization has changed. So it is going to be very difficult for us to go back to business as usual in a pre-2020 sense. So I think we are in for a very, very calibrated and deliberate, melting of the ice with China. And the Chinese have to do more, much more, to meet India's core concerns.
Okay. Just the final question, Ambassador Saran, because of course you've been in Moscow, you followed the India-Russia relationship very, very closely. And we have seen the announcement from Kremlin that President Putin will not be coming for the G20 summit in New Delhi. Kremlin says that he's going to focus on the special operations. Even as we speak here today for this podcast, while I'm recording it on 28th of August, there's a press release put out by the Kremlin that President Putin has had a telephonic conversation with Prime Minister Modi. Still doesn't indicate what will be the nature of his participation, whether it will be virtual, whether his foreign minister Lavrov will be in Delhi, like we saw happen during the BRIC summit. What does it mean for G20? Also, we've seen the Canadian Prime Minister in his conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky say that, this is disappointing that Ukraine has not been invited to the G20 summit. What do you make of Putin's absence in person in G20 and the fact that an invitation wasn't extended to Ukraine?
Yeah, so it's clearly bad for the G20. I mean, the absence of Russia is, and this is what, so I think it's the G7 which is basically driving the agenda. The other members are silent bystanders. I think the reason for his not coming has nothing to do with us or the India-Russia relationship. It has everything to do with his assessment of likely humiliation or other, acts which he might be confronted with if he were to attend in person. And clearly, he's taken a decision that he will not subject himself to any such slights. But the relationship with India is different, and I think we should separate the two. But yeah, I mean, the G20 was actually never meant to be a political forum. But we know there are no surprises that the G7 and the NATO and the Western Alliance have taken a position, and they're not going to budge from that position, even if they have excellent relations with India. The question of whether they would like to dilute some of their opposition because of their friendship with India and not to embarrass India, I don't think they're going to do that. So I think the overriding fault line is the West versus Russia. Right. Insofar as Ukraine and Canada, etc., is concerned, look, there is a huge Ukrainian population in Canada, like the Tamils and this and that, massive. There are hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians. So there is a domestic element in the Canadian posturing, apart from the, professed position about unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine. I I would have been very surprised if India had invited Ukraine and in the absence of Russia. I think that would have been a little, too
Not
over the
even for
top.
a virtual address or something.
I think at best you could have probably had a balancing act where you had Russia virtual and Ukraine virtual. But to have Russia absent 100% and Ukraine present, that I think would have been somewhat of a kind of a extreme step, which would be very uncharacteristic of India. So, but yeah, I mean, we thought things might change after Bali and so on, but it's this year has been rough on the ground
Right.
for both, and therefore Russia's absence. Russia is not a economically significant economy like the Chinese or the G7, like China's. They're $2 trillion. Yeah, they're a major source of energy, raw materials. But in the G20 framework, they are somewhat less significant than maybe, say, even Germany or France or and so on. So, but yes, politically and strategically, they are very much part of G20. But it's happened in the past. I mean, 2014, he, I think, either didn't go to Australia or he cut short his visit from Australia for the G20. So these things, are known to have happened.
On a lighter note, I think, it's difficult being Mr. Lavrov because Mr. Putin, of course, gets to choose and be away from these summit meetings. Mr. Lavrov is the one facing the physical heat constantly in all these rooms.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
thank you so much, Ambassador Pankaj Saran. It's interesting that, of course, the next chairmanship of BRICS is actually with Russia, and which also came up in that conversation where Mr. Putin and Mr. Modi did say, and the release says that the significance of the agreements reached, primarily the expansion of BRICS, which will undoubtedly contribute to the growth of its influence in international affairs, was emphasized. So a lot of multi-alignments, a lot of groupings happening here. And as Ambassador Saran said, India clearly wants to have its presence felt in every room possible today. So thank you so much, Ambassador Saran, for joining me here on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Smita, for having me. Thank you so much. Thank you very
And that
much.
was Ambassador Saran, of course, who has literally seen the BRICS shape up brick by brick. That's all that we have time for on this edition of Beyond Nation and State. We will also, in fact, look at the outcomes of the G20 summit in a later episode. But for now, remember to download the Suno India app as well as listen into all the past episodes on Apple and Spotify. And if you do tune in, please do share your feedback, your thoughts, your ratings on the app. You can engage with me on Twitter at Smita_Sharma and on Facebook and Insta as Smita Sharma Journalist. Thanks for tuning in.